Archaeologists have begun a major new excavation of the Roman city of Pompeii. It was destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago after Mount Vesuvius erupted.
Nearly 2,000 years ago, a volcano erased an entire city in a single day.
There are many stories left to tell about this lost Roman world.
That part you've heard. What you haven't heard is what's happening now.
Something like a detective story. It was really incredible.
Modern CT scans and artificial intelligence are going inside the casts and the bodies, separating plaster from real bone and revealing details no one could see before.
It's very interesting how they found the bodies.
Think signatures etched into bone, traces of life preserved in the smallest places, and a new pattern that may change how we think they died.
I'll be exploring the ancient landscape for clues and using the latest scientific revelations to uncover how these people lived 2,000 years ago.
Tonight, we'll open that evidence piece by piece and show what was actually happening in their last second alive. The final hours of Pompeii. Before noon in the late summer of the year 79 AD, people around the Bay of Naples looked up and saw something no one had words for. A pale column was blasting out of Mount Vesuvius, straight up like the trunk of a huge pine tree. Then at the top, the column spread out and flattened, like branches on that same tree. They couldn't know it then, but that exact moment, the shape of the cloud, the speed of the fall, the heat that followed, would leave marks still readable nearly 2,000 years later. And now, with modern CT scans and AI, we can finally decode those marks, revealing what really happened in the final hours of Pompeii.
With the help of these new discoveries, I'm going to explore the stories of 5 people who lost their lives.
That description comes from a young Roman named Pliny, who watched the whole thing from across the water in the town of Misenum and later wrote about it in 2 long letters. Those letters are the only eyewitness account we still have. This was not a slow lava spill. Vesuvius was blowing rock, ash, and gas with the force of a bomb. Modern studies say the volcano shot hot debris and gas more than 20 miles into the air, and it did it with unbelievable energy, orders of magnitude stronger than nuclear blasts.
The explosion would have triggered chaos and panic for all those we're following.
Ash and light gray pumice, which is foamy volcanic rock, began to fall back down like hard rain. It kept falling for hour after hour. Roofs started to sag under the weight. People tried to cover their faces with cloth. Floors filled up ankle-deep, then knee-deep. The first phase of the disaster lasted about 18 to 20 hours, dropping a thick blanket of ash and pumice across Pompeii. Pompeii, in that period, was a busy Roman town with thousands of residents, plus traders and visitors. Archaeologists think the combined population of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the nearby coastal towns was well over 20,000 people. By the time digging was able to reach the ruins many centuries later, the remains of more than 1,500 victims had been found in Pompeii and Herculaneum, and there are likely many more that have never been uncovered. The true death toll is still not known because parts of the buried area are still sealed underground or lie below modern buildings. Night did not bring safety. After almost a full day of falling debris, the volcano changed its behavior. The tall column above Vesuvius began to collapse, and that collapse turned into something even more violent: pyroclastic surges. A pyroclastic surge is a fast, ground-hugging wave of ash, gas, and tiny shards of rock, heated to hundreds of degrees. You can think of it like an avalanche made of burning dust. Those waves rushed down the volcano and across the landscape, wrapping around walls and through doorways. They hit Herculaneum first and basically erased it, then struck Pompeii early the next morning. Temperatures inside those surges have been measured in the hundreds of degrees Celsius, easily hot enough to kill a person in an instant. And the force and speed of the surges meant people had no time to outrun them. When those waves slammed into the streets, everyone left inside was done. People dropped where they stood. Some collapsed in courtyards, some in doorways, some in the open as they tried to reach the gates. Excavations at places like the Nocera Gate, one of the exits on the southern side of town, show people who almost made it out and then never took another step. The violence of that morning is why so many of the dead were found in almost lifelike poses. What buried them was not just loose ash. Layer after layer of pumice, ash, and collapsed roof material fell, drifted, and then packed down like cement. In a lot of rooms, the air got cut off almost right away. Wood beams charred and then turned to carbon. Bread that had been baking in ovens blackened instead of fully burning away. Tables, beds, lamps, jars of oil, bowls of fruit, all of it was trapped under this hot, choking fall and then sealed under more debris. The same process also choked off the last breath of people who had tried to hide indoors, thinking thick walls would protect them. When the surge and ash covered a victim, the person's body made an imprint in that ash. Then, over time, the soft parts of the body, the muscles, the organs, the skin, slowly broke down and disappeared. But the packed ash around them stayed firm. That left a hollow space in the ground, a perfect body-shaped mold. One of the most painful places where this shows up is a spot that's now called the Garden of the Fugitives. That area, along the southern edge of Pompeii in what had been a vineyard and outdoor dining space, holds 13 bodies, men, women, and children. They were found lying on the ground, some close together and others just a little distance away like a group that broke in panic. They weren't deep underground. They were just above a layer of pumice that had already piled up more than 11 feet high, which means they were walking on top of that pumice, trying to get out toward the gate, when the final surge rolled over them and killed them all at once. For a long time after Pompeii was rediscovered in the 1700s, excavators didn't care about stories like that. They weren't thinking about last breaths or daily life. Early digs were basically treasure hunts ordered by kings.
This excavation has already given up some incredible new treasures after only a few months.
Workers tunneled in, grabbed statues, jewelry, and painted panels off the walls, and sent the pretty pieces to royal collections. That kind of looting tore up context, meaning where people were found, how rooms were set up, what was sitting next to what, and a lot of quiet details about normal Roman life were destroyed before anyone even thought to write them down. In the 1860s, everything changed under a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli. Fiorelli was put in charge of the ruins around 1860 to 1863, and instead of blasting tunnels, he slowed the work down and treated Pompeii like a city that needed to be recorded, not a mine that needed to be stripped. He numbered the blocks and streets so that each find could be mapped. And most famously, he had an idea no one had tried before. When his team came across those hollow, body-shaped spaces in the hardened ash, he had them pour liquid plaster into the void.
The result is accurate plaster copies of the victims, exactly as they died.
When the plaster set, they chipped away the ash around it. What came out was a human figure at the exact second of death. You could see a knee pulled up. You could see a hand over a face. You could see clothing, sandals, even a rope or buckle, sometimes still in place. This plaster method, which Fiorelli first used in 1863, pulled entire people back out of the earth. Over time, more than 100 of these casts were made in Pompeii and nearby sites like Oplantis and Herculaneum. The same trick was used not only on people, but also on animals. There is even a famous cast of a dog still twisted on its chain. The casts were displayed in glass cases in museum halls. Some stayed where they were found, still lying in open sheds or shallow shelters in Pompeii itself. But even with all that, for almost 150 years, the casts could only tell part of the story. You didn't know if you were looking at a man or a woman. You didn't know if two people lying together were family or strangers. You didn't know if the person in front of you had been old or young, sick or healthy, rich or poor. Inside the plaster, the original bones were still there, sealed inside that shell from 1863. But you could not open that shell to look, because if you cracked it apart, you would destroy the only full-body shape that person left behind. That wall finally started to crack when scientists found a way to look straight through the plaster shells without breaking them at all. The hidden truth inside Pompeii's casts. The turning point arrived with CT technology. A CT scan, short for computed tomography, is basically a medical X-ray machine on steroids. It takes thousands of super-thin slices of the body from every angle, each slice thinner than about 3/100ths of an inch, and then stacks all those slices into a three-dimensional model you can turn, zoom, and measure. Hospital scanners like the Siemens Somatom definition flash can scan a whole chest in about half a second, with the machine spinning fast enough to grab a full rotation in about 0.28 seconds, which is less than a third of a heartbeat. Around 2014 to 2016, the archaeological team in Pompeii did something nobody had tried on this scale before. With help from medical partners, they brought full clinical CT equipment, including a 16-slice hospital scanner on loan from Philips, straight onto the site and started running full-body scans on the plaster casts themselves. The plan was to scan at least 86 human casts, including some of the most famous figures from the Garden of the Fugitives plus other bodies that had been restored. The scanner they used was fast enough to capture a whole body in about 100 seconds and powerful enough to see through plaster, metal supports, and ash without having to move fragile remains to a hospital. Recent teams feed those stacks into software that can automatically outline bone and other hard tissue in CT images. The same kind of deep learning tools hospitals now train to mark bone edges and even flag tumors without a human tracing every single frame by hand. These AI models learn pattern differences in density and texture, so they can tag what's real anatomy, what's repair plaster, and what's a support rod. The first shock was that many of these casts were not hollow. Inside a lot of them, the CT images showed complete skulls, full jaw lines with teeth still in place.
We can see the teeth. We know the teeth. We can see about the diet. We can know the sex because we can see very well the morphology of the pelvis.
Neck bones, ribs, shoulder joints, spines, pelvises, arms, and fingers. The scans even picked up tiny details like hairpins, belt fittings, little bits of jewelry, and metal fasteners pressed against bones, stuff you can't see from the outside at all. In at least one victim, Connecticut slices showed what looked like a buckle or clasp sitting across the upper chest, something that never showed through the plaster on the surface. This level of detail blew the door wide open, because suddenly each cast wasn't just a shape. It was a full human body, mapped in 3 dimensions. Being able to see those bones also meant experts could finally do real forensic work. Bones change in predictable ways as a person gets older. Teeth wear down, the ends of long bones fuse, and joints in the spine start to stiffen. The pelvis and skull also carry strong markers of biological sex in adults. CT lets you measure those spots with no cutting, the same way a coroner would in a modern case. This meant researchers could now estimate age at death, height, and even spot old injuries or healed fractures, all while the body stayed sealed inside its plaster shell on the table. But the scans didn't just answer questions. They also shattered a lot of stories that people thought were true. For more than a century, the twisted poses of these bodies were usually shown in museums as proof of slow, gasping death. You'll see these figures with arms bent up, fists clenched by the face, backs arched, legs pulled in tight. Forensics says something else. That pose has a name: pugilistic attitude. Pugilistic, like pugilist, meaning a boxer. It's the same tight, curled fighting stance firefighters still see today in bodies from building fires. When the human body is hit by very intense heat, muscles dry out fast and shrink. As they shrink, they pull on the arms and legs, yanking the elbows in, curling the wrists and bending the knees. The spine can arch backward. The hands clench so hard that fingers dig into the palms. This can happen whether the person is alive or already dead. It's automatic. The victims around the Bay of Naples were exposed to that kind of brutal heat in a flash, and their bodies locked into that boxer pose, not over minutes, but instantly. CT scans lined up perfectly with that story. When researchers looked at ribs, arm bones, and skulls in the scans, they saw cracking and break patterns that match heat shock. And then there's the single most disturbing case scientists keep coming back to. A case that doesn't come from inside one of the plaster casts, but from a body found nearby in the same disaster zone. In the coastal town of Herculaneum, researchers studied the skull of a young man whose body had been found lying face down on a wooden bed. When they looked inside the skull, they didn't find dried tissue. They found something that looked like black glass. It was shiny and brittle. At first, nobody wanted to believe what it was. Then microscopes showed tiny nerve structures still inside that glass. They were looking at a human brain that had been flash-cooked and turned into glass. Forensic specialists led by Pier Paolo Patrone at the University of Naples Federico II ran tests on that glassy material. They found proteins and fatty molecules that match what you'd expect in human brain and spinal tissue. They also ran heating and cooling experiments to figure out how that glass could even exist. The result was brutal. The only way to lock a human brain into glass like that is a blast of heat of at least about 510 degrees Celsius. That's more than 950 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by a drop in temperature so fast that the tissue doesn't have time to fully burn away. That sudden flash cooking and snap cooling is called vitrification. Experts say this may be the first confirmed case on Earth of a human brain turned into natural organic glass. The CT project also embarrassed a lot of old museum labels. For generations, guides would point to a cast and tell a story like, "This is the mother shielding her child," or "This is the servant crouching at his master's feet," or "This poor pregnant girl died trying to crawl away." Those stories were usually based on the outside shape. A slimmer body was called a woman, a heavier build was called a man, and a rounded belly was called pregnancy. But when experts finally scanned the bones inside, they saw something different. In some famous cases, the pelvis showed the figure was actually male, not female. Another surprise from the scans was the state of some of the casts themselves. Researchers found that a few of the older casts barely had any skeleton left inside at all. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, restorers sometimes pushed in metal rods and braces to hold the shape, then packed everything with filler. In other words, not every body on display was actually a solid, untouched time capsule. Some of them were more like repair jobs, patched up to look whole. CT made that visible because metal shows up in bright contrast compared to bone and plaster. You could literally see the rods sitting where a spine should have been. Even with all of this, Connecticut could not tell what everyone really wants. Who were these people when they were alive? Where did they come from? What long-term sickness did they carry in their bodies before that final moment? AI rebuilds Pompeii's lost lives. Scientists are finally pulling real biological information out of Pompeii's victims. Their DNA, their illnesses, their diet, even where they might have grown up. For a long time, nobody thought this would ever be possible because the bodies were exposed to extreme heat, and heat usually wrecks bone and ruins genetic material. But in 2022, an international team finally proved that under all that ash, real, readable human DNA survived. That breakthrough started with two people who were found in a house in Pompeii known as the Casa del Fabbro, which means House of the Craftsman. Archaeologists had uncovered them decades ago. Both of them were still lying where they had fallen in the corner of what used to be a dining room with a low couch used for reclining during meals. The first person was a man in his late 30s to around 40 years old, about 5 feet 5 inches tall. The second person was a woman a little over 50, around 5 feet tall. To get DNA without destroying the remains, researchers went for a specific part of the head called the petrous bone. The petrous bone sits deep near the ear and it's insanely dense. Because it's so dense, it protects DNA better than most other bones, even after almost 2,000 years. By drilling a tiny sample from that area, scientists were able to recover millions of fragments of genetic code from the man, and enough from the woman to at least identify her. In the man's case, they were able to rebuild almost his entire genome, basically his full instruction manual. The team didn't just get his DNA. They also picked up signals from bacteria that infect humans. When they looked at his spine, they saw damage in one of the lower back bones that matched something called Pott's disease. Pott's disease is when tuberculosis spreads into the spine and eats away at the vertebrae. His lower back was getting destroyed by an infection while he was still alive. Tuberculosis in the spine can cause constant pain, trouble standing upright, weakness in the legs, and even difficulty walking. Researchers pointed out that his physical condition might explain why he and the woman with him didn't make it out. They were still inside, leaning against furniture, like escape wasn't even on the table. Now that scientists had his genome, they could ask something people have wondered forever. Who were these people in terms of ancestry? The man's DNA showed that, genetically, he fit most closely with people living in central Italy during the Roman Empire. His DNA also carried signals that match populations around the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Greece, Anatolia, and parts of the Near East. The same work showed connections to lineages that first spread into Italy long before the eruption, including ancestry linked to Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, and some influence from people whose roots trace back to the Eurasian steppe. This mix is exactly what you'd expect in a port city tied into Roman trade routes. At the time of the eruption, Pompeii sat just south of modern Naples. It wasn't a quiet little farm village. It was a busy port city and also kind of a getaway town for wealthy Romans. You had fancy villas with art and dining rooms made for hosting, but you also had workshops, shipping traffic, and people coming in from all over to work, serve, trade, or be forced to work. That means sailors, merchants, craftspeople, enslaved laborers, freed laborers, cooks, guards, everyone, all moving through the same streets. The DNA evidence supports that picture. Once scientists proved they could grab this kind of information from one house, they scaled up. By 2024, researchers from institutions in Italy, Denmark, the United States, and Germany sampled bone from 14 different casts that were being restored. From those bones, the team pulled genome-wide ancient DNA, which means long stretches of genetic code, plus strontium isotope data. Strontium is a naturally occurring element that gets stored in your teeth and bones based on where you grew up, so it works like a location tag. Together, those two things, DNA and strontium, let them check ancestry, sex, and whether certain people were related. That's where things got personal, fast. In one famous case, a body wearing a gold bracelet and holding a small child was always described as a mother and her kid. The DNA said no, that adult was actually male, and not biologically related to the child. In another case, two bodies said to be sisters, or maybe a mother and daughter, turned out to include at least one biological male. The same study also looked at a group of 4 people found together in a wealthy home. For years, they were shown as one tidy Roman family, like a tragic final portrait. The genetics said something else. None of them shared close blood ties. They weren't parents and kids at all. They were unrelated people who ended up in the same hiding place. Now let's talk about what daily life looked like for these people, because science can actually tell us what they were eating and how strong their bodies were before the disaster. When researchers study ancient diet, one of the main tools they use is something called stable isotope analysis. Your bones record chemical signals from the food you eat. Different foods like wheat, beans, pork, or fish from the bay leave slightly different chemical patterns in bone collagen, which is the protein part of bone. By measuring forms of carbon and nitrogen locked in the bones of people from Pompeii, scientists can see what kind of protein and plant food those people were living on. The results paint a pretty full dinner table. The people of Pompeii were eating grain-based bread, beans and lentils, olives, figs, grapes, cabbage, onions, and other vegetables, plus meat from domestic animals and wild game, and a significant amount of seafood from the Bay of Naples. They were also using garum, a fermented fish sauce that Pompeii was famous for exporting all over the Roman world, which basically means salty fish flavor was going into everything. This wasn't a sugar-heavy menu. There was no refined white sugar like we have today. Sweetness mostly came from fruit and honey. That matters for their bodies, especially their teeth. When researchers looked closely at the teeth of Pompeii residents, they found very few cavities and very little gum disease. Another possible boost is that the local water around Vesuvius naturally carried minerals, including fluorine, which works kind of like the fluoride that gets added to modern tap water to protect enamel. So you've got people 2,000 years ago walking around with stronger teeth than a lot of modern adults. You can even read lifestyle in the wear patterns of those teeth and bones. Strong attachment points where muscles grabbed onto bone tell us many residents were physically active, not soft and fragile. Researchers have described thick chest and shoulder structure in some adult males, along with spinal compression in younger men that can come from heavy repetitive work, like lifting loads or doing manual labor every day. At the same time, others clearly had access to fine goods, money, and imported foods. You see jewelry, coins, and luxury objects in houses with decorated dining rooms, and the food record includes not just local fish and farm produce, but also pricey flavorings such as pepper that had to travel from as far away as India along Roman trade routes. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.